Aujourd'hui, un sujet émergent, un sujet qui mobilise de plus en plus de monde à travers la planète. Nous avons été souvent sollicités au cours des derniers mois à propos des OECM en anglais, des AM16 en français, ces autres mesures de conservation par zone effective. Et nous sommes ravis d'avoir aujourd'hui de très grands experts avec nous pour nous accompagner sur cette question et répondre à vos questions. Merci à tous d'être, comme toujours, très nombreux à vous connecter. Nous sommes, comme à chaque fois, ravis du succès de ces webinaires et de retrouver la plupart de nos followers et de nos amis qui viennent d'un peu partout sur la planète. Comme vous le savez, en tant que participant, vous pourrez poser les questions à travers la question box. Vous avez une petite icône en bas qui va vous permettre de poser ces questions. Vous les écrivez. Nous allons vous répondre en direct si les questions sont simples et nous allons agréger vos questions pour les poser à la
You
fin du
can
webinaire.
also aggregate your question at the end of the panel
Comme vous savez
today.
aussi, vous
So
avez
as you also know, you have access to the
en anglais.
interpretation both in English and in French. So this webinar will be recorded for us to have it available on
Le
our YouTube
Conservatoire du
channel.
Littoral est un organisme
So
franco-français. Je suis le directeur du
Conservatoire du
Conservatoire
Littoral
international.
is a
Et
French
notre métier en
public
France, c'est
institution, and
d'accompagner les
our
projets
work in
préservés
France is
durablement.
to acquire
Donc,
parcels
coopération
of
internationale
coastline in order to turn them
différenciée d'autres,
into
la Méditerranée,
restored,
l'Atlantique et aussi
developed, and welcoming
pour essayer
sites
d'appuyer
to
les
try
pays,
to
régions et
support
ONG,
countries,
collectivités
regions,
qui nous
and
demandent dans la mise en place de politiques, de stratégies ou de projets très concrets de gestion des côtes et depuis maintenant de nombreuses années. Nous avons développé maintenant depuis plusieurs années un programme qui s'appelle ICO pour Island Coast Ocean Solutions. Notre idée, c'est de mobiliser différents acteurs afin d'arrêter de nous plaindre de la dégradation des milieux, de la disparition des écosystèmes, mais au contraire, de manière à trouver collectivement ensemble des solutions pour leur préservation durable. Aujourd'hui, les membres de l'organisation, et vous avez moi, comme je me suis présenté, il y a Cyrielle Grouard, que vous connaissez, qui s'occupe du back-office et qui vous répondra à vos différentes questions techniques. Il y a Marie qui a rejoint l'équipe pour quelques mois, qui s'occupe de ce webinaire et qui, elle, sera derrière la question box. C'est à elle que vous adressez. Et je remercie d'avance Bellarmin pour toute l'introduction qu'il est en train de nous apporter. Aujourd'hui, notre épisode sera sur les OECM. Donc d'abord, nous allons avoir la chance d'avoir une représentante de la Convention sur la diversité biologique qui va nous faire un point sur les OECM. Pourquoi, d'où ça vient, quelles sont les idées, pourquoi cette émergence depuis quelques années. Ensuite, Olivier va vous présenter qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un OECM, comment ça marche, comment on les évalue, etc. Nous ferons une petite phase de questions, donc n'hésitez pas pendant ces deux premières présentations à d'ores et déjà commencer à poser vos questions générales. Petite phase de questions-réponses où nous aurons Olivier et Sakil qui répondront à vos questions. Par la suite, nous ferons une deuxième partie avec un point d'avancée sur les OECM et le développement des OECM en Europe, en Asie et dans différents pays un petit peu hotspots sur la planète. Nous aurons sans doute un retour aussi du National Park Service de Corée qui va nous expliquer quelles ont été leurs procédures, leurs processus, leurs méthodes, leurs volontés pour mettre en place ce type de mesures dans leur pays. Et à la fin, nous aurons l'ensemble du panel qui répondra à vos questions. Donc aujourd'hui, comme je vous le disais très rapidement, nous avons la chance d'avoir Sakile Silichena, Olivier Imas, Mohamed Khalil Sayed Pacha et Dr Ha qui seront là pour présenter puis répondre à vos questions. Mais je vais les laisser se présenter eux-mêmes et je vais donner tout de suite la parole à Olivier. Olivier, bonjour. Est-ce que vous pouvez vous présenter en une minute, nous dire qui vous êtes et pourquoi vous êtes là aujourd'hui avec nous?
Bonjour, alors je suis Olivier, je suis pour les OECM en Europe le coordinateur des OECM pour le WCPA, c'est l'organisation internationale des aires protégées, à partir de l'UICN. oui, je travaille sous les OECM en Europe. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup Olivier. Je laisse la parole maintenant à Khaled Pacha. Khaled, présentez-vous s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm Khalid Pasha. I'm based here in Bangkok, in Thailand. And I'm working for IUCN Asia Regional Office here. And I lead the work on protected, conserved, and heritage areas. Thank you so much.
Merci, thank you, Khaled. Nous avons aujourd'hui aussi le docteur A qui n'est pas encore connecté à ma connaissance puisqu'il y a un petit problème technique. Il va nous rejoindre, je l'espère. Voilà, on va trouver une solution. Merci d'avance d'excuser son retard pour des raisons techniques. Et je vais tout de suite passer la parole à Sakile Silicena pour se présenter et ensuite directement faire sa présentation. Sakile, à vous la parole.
Thank you, Fabrice. Thank you, everybody. My name is Sakile Silicena, and I lead the work of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity on science and policy. And I also lead the work on protected and conserved areas. So, Fabrice, I should continue directly with my presentation. So first of all, before I continue my presentation, I would like to thank the Conservatoire Littoral for the invitation. And in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about how OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, emerged under the Convention on Biological Diversity, why it was developed, what it aims to achieve, and what it looks like now under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So if we can move on to slide 2. Yes, that's the slide. So why OECMs? Well, in the lead up to 2010, the convention had adopted many decisions relating to protected areas and a target for reaching 10% by 2010. And it was recognized that even though there was progress with protected areas, there was many areas outside of protected areas that were conserved, that were delivering biodiversity conservation outcomes, even though they were not formally protected. And this includes areas such as sacred sites, sustainable use areas, set-aside areas, private protected areas. And those areas contributed to biodiversity conservation, to ecological connectivity, effectiveness, and they were managed with equity. And so the idea was that OECMs also give us an opportunity to recognize the contributions made by indigenous peoples and local communities, by private actors, and even other sectors. And there was also the recognition that OECMs give us an opportunity to close the ecological and governance gaps in global conservation. Next slide. So in 2010, when the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020 was adopted, it had 20 targets. They were called Aichi biodiversity targets. And Aichi target 11 specifically was relating to protected areas, protected and conserved areas. And that was the first formal reference of other effective area-based conservation measures. And this concept was not really well defined through the Aichi targets. And so countries were grappling with it and thinking about how to introduce it. And so in 2016 at COP13, the parties requested clarification of this concept and guidance on how to identify other effective area-based conservation measures and how to report on their progress. And so in 2018, at the next COP, the guidance was delivered and it was adopted by the decision of the Conference of the Parties, Decision 1418. And so basically what it boils down to is that OECMs are recognized as areas not designated as protected areas, but they are governed in ways which achieve the in situ conservation of biological diversity. Next slide. And so when negotiating and adopting the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in 2022, parties to the convention recognized that OECMs had become established approach for the conservation of biological diversity. Target 3 of the convention is specifically related to protected and conserved areas. It builds on Aichi Target 11 and it aims to achieve 30% of protection in terrestrial, inland waters, marine and coastal areas. And OECMs were specifically mentioned as a form of achieving biodiversity conservation. We believe very strongly under the convention that OECMs are going to be the difference between whether we achieve the 30% target or not. But more than that, OECMs will also help us to achieve representativity of biodiversity ecosystems. It will help us to conserve areas which are important for biodiversity, will help with connectivity and with equitable governance. So to conclude, OECMs offer an inclusive, outcomes-based approach to conservation because we are looking more at the conservation outcomes. They help us to diversify people that are involved in conservation by going beyond formal protected areas. And they help us also to achieve equity because then some of the areas are managed by a diverse set of actors. And they are key to us being able to deliver the 30% target for biodiversity conservation. So, yes, thank you for your time and back to you, Fabrice.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Sakile, pour cette introduction générale très riche et qui nous permet de poser le décor. Nous allons aller maintenant un peu plus loin dans la définition et pour cela, nous allons demander à Olivier de nous préciser de son côté, effectivement, avec le point de vue qu'il a, quelle est effectivement la définition précise de cet OECM et comment ça marche. Olivier, à vous la parole.
So sorry, I'm laughing because to have a strict definition is hard. I mean, the whole idea of OECMs is to integrate many other systems. Anyway, next slide, please. Voilà, merci. So Sakile gave a quick introduction to the text of OECMs, which is this bit on the right. But it could be broken down into 5 parts. Systems that are outside protected areas that are governed and managed in a way that, in an equitable way, that are sustained long-term conservation outcomes of biodiversity, and include various cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other values. Each of these 5 subcategories are in themselves difficult to measure. I mean, this is maybe why we have a lot of confusion on OECMs. For instance, just the first one may be simple to say an area other than a protected area, but for instance, Ramsar sites, in some countries they're classified as protected areas, in other countries they're not classified as protected areas, which means that for OECMs, we really need to have a case-by-case approach, looking at each case separately and discussing each of these terms in their specific case that we find. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. So the CBD, when it was came when it finally accepted the OECM definition, asked IUCN to help in creating technical guidance. It also asked UNEP WCMC to help in the monitoring and evaluation of OECMs. So IUCN now has several toolkits that help in the process of recognizing OECMs. The most recent toolkit, which came out last year, is basically a method that is split into three. The first part is to screen the proposal OECM. So this is basically a desk study that looks at things like, is it in a protected area? Is it outside a protected area? Are there local communities involved? And so on and so forth. If a site passes this first step, then there is a second step, which is more to get consent. It is looking, as some may know, free prior informed consent is trying to make sure that all the stakeholders are interested in the area being an OECM, would like to participate in the process, and so on and so forth. And the final step is its full assessment itself. And this is where some of the complications start coming in, because in it there are 6 criteria. Some of these criteria cover biodiversity. Is there biodiversity in the area? Some criteria cover geography. So is it can the area be placed on a GIS map? Some of it then looks at the governance and in situ long-term conservation and equity and rights. And each of these, while biodiversity is rather simple to define, when we start going to the more social side is where difficulties start coming up. And so IUCN with other partners has also started developing various tools such as SAGE and so on and so forth to help in these processes. The final step is to basically to bring all this information together and, like a traffic light system, see whether it the site could potentially be an OECM. If it does go through the systems, and if it can then be reported to the UNEP WCMC database, which is a protected area database, where it is then included as contributing towards the target 3, so 30 by 30. Le prochain diapo, s'il vous plaît. So maybe before we go on to the challenges, what are the benefits and the opportunities? Well, first of all, OECMs allow us to integrate systems that, as Sakili said a bit earlier on, systems that have been doing conservation, but have been doing it for thousands of years. So these are recognizing systems which predate the state. And in this way, we hope to be able to reduce conflict and integrate everybody who does conservation. So when we start talking about other systems, this is where further complications comes. Because first of all, this means we have to start changing our language, because we're no longer talking to conservationists who have a biological, ecological language, but maybe to people who even the word conservation or ecosystems or biodiversity threatens them due to their history with protected areas and so on and so forth. So first of all, we have to learn to change the way we speak. We also have to start understanding other systems which don't conform to the way we see conservation and effective management. You know, a sacred site, for many of us, while we see it as a biodiversity component, how do we explain it to us? It's complicated. But there's also other systems, you know, pastoralism, drinking water, and so on and so forth, that have their own systems and their own way of doing things, which aren't always evident to a conservation or ecologist background. Prochain diapo, s'il vous plaît. So, what are the challenges? Well, the first challenge is really that it's new. It's new and it uses very much a case-by-case way of doing things, which means that you cannot do a homogeneous blanket method for OECMs. We have to set aside our preconceptions, but we also have to start doing capacity building, both for conservation and scientists to build this new way of looking at conservation, but also with communities, building that there is other ways of doing conservation where they can be included, which is not run solely by the state. But then there's also many technical questions, such as what counts. Sacred areas seem to be pretty clear, but how about set aside in a forestry concession? How, as we were going to mention, talk about later on, how long is long-term effective conservation? What do we talk about governance? What type of governance? We usually associate governance with a meeting room, but governance could also be done on the ground while people are doing their day-to-day activities. So these are the changes that we have to face, and one of the things that we're starting to see coming out is that already the acronym itself, OECM, is complicated. And so certain countries are starting to say, well, we have similar systems. Let's use at the national level or local level these local words for OECMs, and maybe when we talked about them at a global level, go back to the OECM acronym. And this is where we are today. We are starting to put the meat on this idea, on this way forward for conservation. But I think even though it has been 10 years, for many countries, for many continents, it's still a very, very new idea. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour ces deux interventions très complémentaires qui nous permettent de mieux comprendre, de mieux saisir, et c'est une très belle introduction. On a déjà quelques questions. Je vais vous en poser une première, et ensuite Marie, on a sélectionné certaines dans la boîte à questions, mais la première c'est: quelle est aujourd'hui la répartition du travail, de la promotion, du suivi, des formations autour de ce concept entre l'IUCN et la Convention sur la diversité biologique? Sakilé et Olivier, si vous pouvez ouvrir vos caméras et essayer de répondre à ces quelques questions qu'on va passer rapidement. Quelle est la répartition du travail entre la CBD et l'IUCN pour développer des OECM dans le monde?
Sakilé, do you want to go ahead?
If you will just give me a quick overview of what Fabrice requested.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my French is non-existent.
Sorry, there's translation, but I'm going to try to speak in English. What is the repartition of roles between IUCN and CBD for the promotion of OECM at the worldwide? Do you separate roles for trainings, sensitization, promotion? How does it work?
Okay, so actually IUCN, the Secretariat, and IUCN, the World Commission on Protected Areas, and its task forces and specialist groups is actually a very solid partner of the convention. As Olivier has said, IUCN has accompanied the convention throughout the process. I think even in the setting up of the Program of Work on Protected Areas in 2004, IUCN has always been a partner. In terms of the technical work, IUCN has been leading a lot of the technical, IUCN, the Secretariat, and IUCN, the World Commission on Protected Areas, has been leading a lot of the work on the definition of, on the development of the definition, but also on the guidance, on the toolkits, as you have seen. I just would like to also mention that we work closely with IUCN, for example, when we do capacity building, when we do promotion through side events at the COP. And we also work with other partners who are active in this space, such as WWF, High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, TNC, Conservation International, even regional organizations.
Thank you, Sakili. Maybe just to add, yes, IUCN and both the Secretary and the Commission have long been part of defining OECMs right from the start. What CBD specifically asks is to start the technical process, guidance. You know, what does that big phrase of what OECMs are, what does it really mean? Start discussing these. But these are just recommendations. You know, they are. Others have started also doing their own recommendations. You know, Canada, the Ministry of Environment has created its own OECM protocol. FAO have one for fish, marine areas, and so on and so forth. One of the things we do try to do in both the Secretariat and especially WCPA, the Commission, is to make sure that this definition doesn't go everywhere. You know, we want to not to have. One of the confusions is there, and I will talk about this a bit later on, is that OECMs are a bin, a box to put everything else that's not a protected area, and that is something we've tried very hard, both CBD, IUCN, Secretariat, and Commissions, trying to make very hard to say, no, it's not. There are very specific criteria, which are often it's a lot more difficult to become an OECM than a protected area. You know, we have a definition is very, very strict. Such as, for instance, biodiversity. An OECM must have biodiversity. A protected area maybe be a protected area for other reasons outside biodiversity. So yes, we do work hand in hand, especially the WCPA Commission with the TBD.
Thank you very much. Marie, please, other questions?
Oui, on a une première question qui porte sur la nature des ANSES et sur la nature des sites qui peuvent être ou non une ANSES. Est-ce qu'il est possible qu'un site soit à la fois ANSES et aire protégée?
Sakili, is this translation true? Sorry, I forget.
Sorry, I did turn on my interpretation. Thank you. Actually, a site cannot be a protected area and an OECM at the same time. That is, I think, the primary definition of an OECM is that it's an area that has not been designated as a protected area.
Yes, and furthermore, it must have biodiversity. I think, as I was saying before, there are lots of sites that have been proposed as OECMs, but there is no biodiversity. And when we talk about biodiversity, we're not talking just about one single species, but a collective of species. So it does have to have, the criteria are very, very strict on what is an OECM. So yes, we do. It does have to be. And then these guidelines that have been created, whether it's IUCNs or the Canadian governments or FAO, so on, so go through the process to make sure that these areas are OECMs. And as I said before, each area has to be looked at in its own specific case.
And I would just like to point out that under the convention, we don't designate OECMs, we identify them. So it's not that we're going into an area and creating an OECM. We are going into an area and we're identifying an area that has an existing governance and biodiversity and identifying that area meets the OECM criteria and can therefore be labeled as an OECM. Thanks.
Et on a une autre question qui porte sur la nature du processus d'identification d'un point de vue des accords internationaux. Je crois que Sakile, tu as déjà un petit peu parlé de ça.
Becky, do you want to reply?
So the CBD decisions from 2018 adopts a definition and a criteria. And then the IUCN, through the WCPA, have gone further, and they have prepared a toolkit for identifying sites as OECMs, but also they've produced some guidance on how to identify OECMs. And furthermore, we have other actors such as FAO and others that have also developed further guidance on OECMs. So guidance on OECMs exists. I think Olivier can talk a little bit more about the work that the IUC, well, he did, but maybe you want to reiterate what you
Maybe just to add that, yes, there is a lot of guidance. Once again, it is guidance. Certain countries are taking this guidance and applying it to their own situation. But maybe more important is the reporting phase, because the reporting for arriving to target 3 is done through the Protected Planet database managed by UNEP WCMC. And they have very specific guidance on how to report, be it a protected area or an OECM. Often it is through government systems. However, in theory, it could also be done directly by a third party directly to protected area database. That hasn't yet been, the framework for that at the moment has not yet been put into place. But in theory, it should be possible.
Thank you very much. One very last question. Un participant demande en fait l'objectif finalement de ces statuts, c'est de protéger la biodiversité. Comment est-ce que ça peut être compatible avec certains espaces qui peuvent être potentiellement des OECM, tout en étant des zones où la pêche est autorisée, où l'objectif de pêche est un objectif principal et pas l'objectif de conservation? Comment est-ce que ça pourrait être rendu compatible?
Sakili?
So again, we'll go back to the definition and criteria of OECMs. OECMs are not always necessary. The objective of OECMs is not necessarily biodiversity conservation, but through the governance and activities taking place in the OECM, you achieve long-term sustained biodiversity outcomes. So the area, the way in which an area is governed should achieve sustained long-term biodiversity conservation outcomes. And for an area to be an OECM, it must have a local governance institution. It must be able to monitor and measure biodiversity outcomes. Like Olivier said, there's a lot of questions about what do we mean by long-term and sustained and whatever. But there should at least be the idea that the governance mechanisms and the actions that are conserving biodiversity should be in place for the long term. That's the one thing. And then it has slipped my mind, the second part that I wanted the second part of the response. I'm sorry, Olivier, please go ahead. What I was going to say has slipped my mind.
You'll come back. I think we also have to be careful here, because the question makes it seem that fishing can't be done in protected areas. We know there are protected areas that have fishing in it. Protected areas and OECMs are equal in value, and there have been people saying, "Oh, an OECM is less likely to conserve biodiversity in a protected area." No, they should both be protecting biodiversity. But we should go back to the early 2000s when OECMs first created. At the time, practitioners were seeing areas that had high biodiversity but were not in the protected areas. And in fact, they were just seeing asking, why is this area got biodiversity? Why is it being protected? yet we don't recognize it. And it's because these systems have been there, sometimes, as I said before, for thousands of years. And as I said, OECMs must have biodiversity at the start, which means restoration site, well, a restoration site could be in a protected area. You cannot have a restoration site in an OECM until that restoration has created biodiversity. So that, there are, as I say, it's still early days, but there's this duality between OECMs v protected areas, to me, is not the right path. They are equal in value. They both protect biodiversity. The one thing I would say, that OECMs have proven to protect biodiversity for thousands of years, while protected areas have only proven to protected areas, as in the Yellowstone model, has only proven to protect biodiversity for 150 years. Which is controversial, but it's true.
Yes, we know that, but especially in France, we typically know that for the moment. Merci beaucoup. Il y a énormément de questions. Je suis désolé, on va pas pouvoir toutes les retenir maintenant. On reviendra sur certaines, notamment la question de Julie sur les OECM versus les MPAs. Mais là, on va continuer à aller de l'avant et je vais laisser tout de suite la parole à nouveau à Olivier. Olivier, reste là, reviens. C'est toi qui vas nous parler de l'état d'avancement des OECM en Europe. Après, on te fera faire une petite pause. Mais voilà, à toi de nous présenter un peu comment ça marche en Europe. Merci.
J'espère d'avoir une petite pause café, mais non. Okay, so Europe. Yes, OECMs in Europe. Until the end of last year, there were no OECMs in Europe. And in December, we suddenly had 5,375 OECMs. First of all, maybe I should talk about Target 3. Europe has half of the countries, Europe as in the European Union, half of the countries have already achieved or about to achieve the 30%. Some are even at 40, 50% for terrestrial. Where the European Union is lagging behind is marine. We still don't have, we only have around 10% of the marine areas in some sort of conserved protected areas systems. However, few of these countries have looked to see if the current systems of special protected areas are effective. And two countries, the Netherlands and I think it was Denmark, were the only two who have. And when they did, they had to reduce their percentage. I think Netherlands Luxembourg went from 50% to 40%, for instance. And this is where, so for many countries, they have this thought that OECMs are not applicable because they are nearly there. However, when they're looking at the specific term of the CBD, that it has to be long-term and effectiveness, they're now questioning it. So coming back to these 5,000 OECMs of last year, they were all created by Sweden. And Sweden currently, for the terrestrial, is at about 15%. The issue here is that, and this is the only country that has OECMs, declared OECMs to the protected area database. The issue is that while OECM process should be very, very transparent, it has not been in Sweden. And from the little we know, it's the ones that have been created are all linked to forestry concessions and they're set aside. So it's not a very positive picture at the moment. When we go to the legislation for OECMs, here as well, we are lagging behind. There is a draft measure from 2022 that talks about OECMs within the larger 30 by 30, but this has basically linked OECMs to contracts. So they're asking potential OECMs to have a contract-based system, which goes against the CBD definition, because it should be available to everyone, and especially for local communities. Some local communities may not want to be have a contract to do biodiversity conservation. But things are changing, as I say, and it's while European Union is promoting OECMs globally and has even funded work on the technical side of OECMs. Applying them on the ground, we are still very, very far behind. So we need your help.
Thank you very much. Merci Olivier. Oui, nous avons besoin de l'aide de chacun et nous avons aujourd'hui beaucoup de participants. Et vu l'origine des questions, les participants sont répartis très largement sur la planète et vont nous aider à promouvoir plus d'aires protégées et plus de statuts parallèles comme les OECM à l'avenir. Je vais tout de suite passer la parole à Khalid Pacha qui va nous parler depuis Bangkok de l'état de développement des OECM à l'échelle asiatique, puisqu'il couvre cette zone géographique, cette région au niveau du UCN. Khalid, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's coming, and I thank the Conservation Littoral and the organizers, and also the speakers, Olivier and Shakile, for laying the foundation and explaining it beautifully, the whole premise about the OECMs. Coming to the OECMs in Asia, we are seeing a whole emergence of the OECMs happening in Asia from different parts of the region. And before I go on to that, I just quickly want to revisit the definition, because here in Asia, what we have started to look at in terms of the definition is, and not to speak about OECMs as a standalone definition. It is an integrated part, an integral part of the protected area system under the Target 3. And what we want to convey as within IUCN and as a wider community, also within the Asia Protected Area Partnership, which we have in Asia here, that OECMs provide secured pathways for species and spaces to coexist with the in situ long-term biodiversity conservation through the structural, ecological, and biological functionality. That is the functionality they have to perform. And it is necessary to see the OECMs as a part of the whole protected area integrated system when we talk about Target 3. They would, to us, they would serve as the circulatory system when we talk about the heart, which is the beating heart is the protected areas, and the OECMs would definitely provide that connectivity and the interconnectedness for the protected areas to be living within the living landscapes. So having said that, coming to the Asia's context, Asia features a rich biodiversity across the region, and looking at some of the conservation approaches, including the sacred natural sites, community managed forest, ICCAs, faith-based areas. So there is a huge variety of categories which we are seeing, which are emerging in terms of being recognized and identified as OECMs. In terms of IUCN role, also in Asia, the office here in the Asia Regional Office also has another role in the being designated as the CBD's Sub-Regional Technical Scientific Cooperation Center to take forward the 23 targets and work with the aligned parties. So under that, talking about the Target 3, we have been supporting the technical guidance, which has been just talked about, the national dialogue, and the regional exchanges on OECMs. Embedded in the IUCN Asia strategy for achieving Target 3 under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, OECMs is one of the integral part, and which I just explained how it is included to be a part of those living landscapes. Contributing to the global OECM criteria also through the knowledge products, working very closely with the WCPA and other partners and the parties here in Asia. We have been trying to mainstream the OECMs to be also integrated within the NBSAPs, and the planning which is equally important, because until and unless they become an integral part of the national policies within the NBSAPs, we don't see that there would be much progress which would happen as in terms of institutionalizing the OECMs. Next one, please. Moving forward, what we started with as a journey when we had the 23 targets ratified by the CBD, in Asia, we started to map the progress of the OECMs, and the first publication which came out by IUCN Asia, and which you can find on the IUCN website, was to look at where the countries and what the reflections of the countries were, how the countries were perceiving the OECMs. So that is the first exercise we carried out, looking at the understanding about OECMs, looking at the appetite within Asia, how countries wanted to basically work on OECMs. Having understood that, we started to engage within countries like Bangladesh, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam by organizing and taking a national dialogue and helping those countries to develop their roadmaps and to basically construct a national strategy for the OECMs under the umbrella head of the Asia Protected Area Partnership. We have been also engaging with other countries, providing technical inputs into India through our offices, and also through our regional office into Indonesia, Laos, and Malaysia. So this is something which is now happening. And also, we are very thankful to the Ministry of Environment Japan in 2024 for basically collectively bringing 10 countries from Asia which had really advanced on OECM to understand what could be the potential roadmap for Asia on the OECMs. So looking at some of the lessons learned, looking at some of the experiences through the implementation of the OECMs, building the strategies, some of the early experiences, we have started to put together that roadmap, and that has been published. And again, it's available for the wider audience here on the IUCN website. In terms of the role and mechanisms, as I mentioned, since the IUCN Asia office here is also the secretariat for the Asia Protected Area Partnership, a peer learning platform for integrating OECM governance, we have been providing that. And through that, there is an exchange of knowledge products, exchange of the lessons learned is taking place continuously. As I speak, we have been engaging across in Asia with many countries and providing those technical inputs. In the other role of the IUCN Asia Regional Office as the designated CBD Subregional Technical Scientific Cooperation Center, we are trying to mainstream OECMs using the Global Biodiversity Framework pathways and looking at other collaborative processes. Other collaborative processes, when we talk about, we are already collaborating with the commissions, also working very closely with some of the regional entities and international organizations, including the UN, UNDP, UNEP, FAO, and other relevant UN entities here, taking an advantage of the regional hub for the UN in Asia. Also, we are working together as a union, as IUCN, with our partners and the commissions and the stakeholders, and in driving the OECMs forward as a dialogue and supporting the partners through the technical inputs. Next one, please. So looking at, I'm so sorry for the text, looking at some of the opportunities and the challenges. So what is working and what needs attention? In terms of immediate opportunities, we know that many of the countries who have joined the High Ambition Coalition and looking at 30 by 30 vision, for them, this seems to be one of the pathways for basically trying to look at and contribute towards that goal. Given the human-dominated landscapes largely within Asia, there is a very little room for creating or expanding protected areas within terrestrial areas. it might be some spaces, and definitely there are spaces which are available in the marine realm. So there we are seeing a creation of other protected areas, but also creation of OECMs in terms of community managed fisheries areas, some of the LMMAs and MMAs we have been looked at, marine managed areas. Also, and within the terrestrial ecosystems, when we talk about or the freshwater ecosystems, inland freshwater, there is a very little opportunity to really expand those protected areas. So this is where identifying high biodiversity areas and basically bringing them under the umbrella of OECMs, that's where it has been seen to be working. Opening the doors through the IUCN Green List by bringing in some kind of a sustainable financing and equity-based governance. We are looking at outside protected areas. How can the Green List help in advancing on OECMs? Legitimize community-led and faith-based conservation efforts. There are a lot of lands which belong to the local indigenous people here within Asia or belonging to faith-based organizations, and they have a huge amount of biodiversity interlocked within those areas. So how can we mainstream those and bringing them under the OECMs? And also encouraging the cross-sectoral collaboration. And this is where we have a lot of examples, and you will hear from Dr. Heo also, that we have been trying to bring in on the table the other sectors like the agriculture, extractives, the corporate sector, to look at how they can help in basically conservation of the long-term in situ conservation for biodiversity within some of the areas where they have been carrying out some of the operations and compensatory plans which they have set aside some of the lands to do that, and how they can be serving as a much more meaningful purpose. Looking at some of the challenges, yet we talk about OECMs, but still the understanding is still remains at a low scale, and still there's a lot of socialization, a lot of understanding required as we go subnationally. And looking at also finding pathways through existing enabling policies. And this is very important because what we have seen, some of the countries have started to jacket the OECMs into legislations. This is too early, and what the lessons learned for us and the challenges are that we should rather find ways of enabling the OECMs with the existing policies. Looking at capacity issues and the resource mobilization, and given that the land tenure system is a sovereign system and OECMs are operational beyond protected areas, each country has to design and designate its own categories of OECMs. This would possibly become challenging. Also looking at how we address, so as I have already explained, we have also just recently published a paper which talks about some of these opportunities and the challenges, and this is available on the web. You are most welcome to download this. Can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, just quickly, just to go through this, where do we stand and what is the progress? We are already scaling up and strengthening the dialogue where with some of the countries we have already started to engage over the last couple of years, which include Bangladesh, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. We have also started to build new dialogue and help the other countries which are already listed here on my slide, including India, Indonesia, Laos, Pakistan, and Malaysia. OECMs elements to be integrated into Target 3, roadmaps and NBSAP, as I said in the beginning, and IUCN co-leading awareness application of OECMs criteria across diverse governance type and aligning the typology and unpacking the pathways for effective implementation or operationalization in Asia. So that is some of our role. And looking at the key lessons is how do we really bring the OECMs and bring the trust of the community for OECMs. And this is why I said it is important not to jacket them into laws, but rather finding ways to mainstream OECM with the existing policies and legislations, because this is where the indigenous communities and the people look at with some kind of element of fear that their land may tomorrow be taken away, because if they just designate it on the OECM, and then it could be designated and become basically a part of the conservation. They present a non-regulatory pathway to expand conservation without a formal PA designation. So some of the way, how do we still, without jacketing it into a law, still make it more regulatory, more streamline the process, get a government buy-in with also co-leading with the communities. Communities will play a major role in mainstreaming OECMs if we look at beyond protected areas. Integrating it with the spatial planning and the target 1 is important. And looking at some of the reporting and monitoring, this is going to be a challenge, and there's a lot which we can discuss on this. Probably the last slide, can we just move on to that?
This is the last slide. We don't have any more. Sorry. Thank you very much. We will have
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for all this presentation, very clear, and we will have time for answering new questions, because we have lots of questions in the question box, and we'll try to have the much time as we can to answer that at the end. Thank you again, Khalid. Marie, en quelques mots, faire un point sur les quelques pays qui ont déjà développé de nombreux OECM ou AMSED sur la planète. Est-ce que tu peux nous en dire un peu plus sur ces zones, un peu ces hotspots?
Oui, donc je voulais évoquer maintenant quelques pays qui ont un certain nombre d'AMSES, mais qu'on n'a pas pu traiter dans le cadre des présentations de nos intervenants. Donc premièrement, le Maroc, qui a plus de 300 AMSES déclarés, dont la majorité sont terrestres, avec des objectifs de conservation surtout secondaires. Ensuite, le Canada, où il y a aussi plus de 300 AMSES enregistrés, où de nouveau la majorité sont terrestres, une cinquantaine côtières. Les Philippines, on a un peu moins de 200 AMSES également, avec les 2/3 qui sont côtières. Et pour finir, la Colombie, pour finir notre petit tour du monde, on a une petite cinquantaine d'AMSES en Colombie, avec des objectifs de conservation surtout primaires et sur des zones terrestres.
Après, on ne t'entend pas parce que tu es en mute là.
Eh oui, merci. Ça s'apprend. Marie, juste pour revenir, est-ce que tu peux me confirmer que ce sont bien les pays qui ont déclaré le plus d'AMSES à l'échelle internationale, ou pourquoi ce sont ces pays qui ont été choisis?
Oui, c'est ça. Ils font partie du top 10 des pays qui ont déclaré le plus d'AMSES. Il y en a certains que j'ai pas évoqués parce que notamment la Suède, par exemple, a été, il me semble, abordé par Olivier Imas. Mais voilà, ils font tous partie du top 10, tout à fait.
Super. Merci beaucoup, Marie. Je vais laisser maintenant la parole au Dr. L. Merci, Dr. L, de nous avoir rejoints, d'avoir trouvé la solution pour pouvoir vous connecter avec nous. Nous sommes très heureux. Il est très tard chez vous, puisque vous êtes en Corée, et vous êtes responsable du National Park Research Institute. Merci de votre présentation pour nous expliquer quelle a été la démarche et comment la Corée s'est beaucoup investie dans ce processus de déclaration des OECM à l'échelle internationale. Dr. O, à vous la parole.
Okay. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. So I'm Ha-Kyung, working for the Korean National Park Service. So next slide, please. So as all of you might be aware, the word of OECM officially appeared in 2010. So however, there was no clear definition of OECM until COP14. So during this period, we were looking for the potential protected areas rather than OECMs in Korea. So after defining the concept, we shaped the ICM Framework Partnership Project on identifying the potential OECMs in Korea. So KMFS is conducting this project in cooperation with IUCN. So to identify the potential OECMs, we have operated the expert forums composed of government officials and relevant experts from various sectors. And then we developed the K-OECM toolkit with reflecting the Korean context, the Korean characteristics based on the global standard. Next slide, please. The first things what we have done is to develop the Korean terminology, which is nature coexistence areas, 자연공존지역. Through fascinating discussion at the forum and the expert survey, we have reached the consensus to use Korean terminology rather than simple translation word in order to increase friendly perception and acceptability for public and stakeholders, and to reduce their concerns on the further regulations. And then we are screening the potential types of OECMs in Korea, and this process is similar with ICN guidelines. Next slide, please. So through a brief screening process, around 30 types of the potential OECMs were identified, including Greenbelt, conservation assets and conservation agreement sites, and proportional biosphere reserve, etc. The maps and tables, so you can see, were created for the purpose of estimating the effect, assuming that all sites of potential types of OECMs are recognized. Regarding the terrestrial land, conservation ratio might increase more than 30%. And protection ratio of KBA, key biodiversity area site, will be above 70%. And one other thing is many of the first class of ecological map that are not protected areas are owned by government side, more than 70%. So this is why the government needs to play a leading role in expanding protected areas and OECMs in Korea. Next slide, please. So we reported 4 sites through this project. The first one is DMZ Green Trust Choron Plainland, is agricultural land. This site is a conservation asset of National Nature Trust. Local residents lead this management and receive some subsidies from Ministry of Environment using payment for ecosystem services. And second one is a Carthusian Order. It's a Catholic monastery off limits to the public. They signed a conservation agreement with National Nature Trust. This monastery emphasized that be with gods in solitude and silence. And third one is the research forest of Busan National University, and with the regulation on the academic forest affiliated to the university. And last one is a site designated as a special conserved area located in Kumgang River. And this area includes one of the key biodiversity area sites and is a very important migratory route for birds. And next slide, please. That's the last slide. These are the lessons learned from the pilot phase in Korea. So first one is that there are lots of duplication with protected areas and among other potential OECMs. So we will try to focus on buffer areas of protected areas and to increase the connectivity among protected areas and OECMs. And we saw lack of protection on the important areas, such as the KBA site, private site. And third one is that various stakeholders' concerns about further regulation and infringement on the right to self-determination after recognizing OECMs. That's why we use the friendly term and operate the expert group. And we plan to make the platform for strengthening the information sharing and the stakeholders participation. Name is 30 by 30 Alliance. This alliance is scheduled to be officially launched in June this year, coinciding with World Environment Day, 5th June. And the seventh thing is we observe the high expectation on the potential OECMs in urban areas, such as ecological park and wetland park, according to the local ordinance. And the ninth thing is how to secure long-term conservation outcomes. So we plan to check the possibility to use IUCN greenness standard to monitor the effectiveness of OECM after identifying. The last issue is how to respond to stakeholders' concerns and expectations, such as regulatory uncertainty and anticipations of incentive. So we need to be nurturing the nature coexistence culture based on the voluntary participation and self-regulation. And another thing is we need to design an appropriate incentive system for regulatory and conservation efforts have been raised. The second phase of the project is scheduled to begin this June, and the main contents will be establishing recognition standard and procedure for institutionalization, the kinds of the certification system, and examining the possibility of applying greenest standard as a monitoring tool, and considering a proper incentive system along with identifying more OECMs. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. A. Avant de passer à la table ronde, je voudrais juste vous poser une question. J'ai vu que dans les potentiels OECM, il y avait une majorité qui serait créée sur des terrains privés. Est-ce que pour vous, c'est une opportunité parce que ça va permettre aux privés de se mobiliser, ou est-ce qu'au contraire, c'est une contrainte qui va compliquer le fait de créer des OECM sur des terrains qui sont privés et donc pas forcément favorables à un niveau de conservation?
So, as you can see my previous slide, so the majority size areas of the post-grade ecological map is not designated as protected areas. It's a majority areas is a government-owned land. So I think at this moment we need to work from the government side. Is better to collect some interest from the private side. So at this moment, government side is do it first, and then raise the awareness from to private sector, and so the more than 50% is owned by private. So we construct some platform, make some platform, and invite various types of stakeholders get together, and then we promote to sharing the information, and so we support them to matchmaking to get some conservation effort to get together.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Je propose à tous les panélistes d'allumer leur caméra puisque nous allons passer désormais à la table ronde. Nous avons de très nombreuses questions. C'est un sujet qui intéresse beaucoup de monde et il y a beaucoup d'interrogations. Ça veut dire que la pédagogie doit encore continuer pour qu'on développe au-delà des top 10 des pays qui ont développé des OECM. Est-ce que vous auriez une explication de pourquoi aujourd'hui il y a si peu de pays qui sont rentrés dans ce processus, et quels sont les facteurs qui font qu'un pays passe c'est un peu on-off, c'est un pays qui a soit pas du tout d'AMSES, soit il en a vraiment. Qu'est-ce qui déclenche ce type de dynamique? Peut-être Sakil pour commencer.
Yes, thank you. I can only speak in general terms because I mean the CBD Secretariat is at the global level. Maybe the other speakers can give more specific examples. But in the past year, we've been in different regions working with different countries with workshops. And I think that the most common issue that we're hearing about OECMs is people are grappling with what are OECMs? What does it mean? What does it not mean? What am I allowed to do? It doesn't help that we have different, so to say, schools of thought on OECMs that are pushing and pulling and saying, well, this is OECMs are just junior protected areas, and other people saying, well, any sustainable use area can be an OECM. And so what you have is you've got regulators mostly caught in the middle because they're not sure how to go about it. So that's one of the things. The second thing is that I think it was Khalid who mentioned it. A lot of countries have a difficulty with the regulatory framework for OECMs. OECMs are not supposed to be designated like protected areas, but a lot of countries cannot act on protected areas unless they have, they cannot act on OECMs unless they have regulations. And so a lot of countries are stuck in that regulatory phase trying to figure out where do OECMs fit within their regulation. And then there's capacity and technical constraints, right? Because Olivier mentioned it already that we should already have biodiversity. These are areas that should already be existing. And so you should be able to just identify the areas and engage with the stakeholders or the rights holders or the landholders. So, for example, the example from Korea, where you see that it's a process. Because people have bad experiences, because with conservation, let's be honest, conservation hasn't always had the best track record. When we come as conservationists and we say we would like to identify your area as an OECM, there's a lot of people, stakeholders, rights holders, landowners, they hold back because we're trying to take this land and put it under contract or under regulatory framework. So these are some of the general issues that we've seen over in the different regions globally.
Merci beaucoup, Sakile. Quelqu'un d'autre veut réagir sur l'explication qui fait que d'un coup un pays se mobilise et a envie et déclare beaucoup de OECM? Olivier, et on passera à une autre question.
Okay. I think it also, as Sakile said, I think it also depends on the history of that country with protected areas. As Sakile said, you know, countries that have had a complicated history due to having to integrate local communities and so on and so forth are sometimes a bit more open to OECMs because it can be a way to reduce its conflict. In Europe, of course, the issue is that local communities aren't recognized in Europe, and so OECMs are not even on the table because local communities aren't even recognized, which is a challenge in itself. There's also then the other challenge of how top down is your state. You know, OECMs are in theory meant to be bottom up. It's very hard for states and the traditional conservation system of protected areas to integrate something that's not which is not top down. And that is very, very difficult because these are, as we said right at the start, these are new concepts, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of working with other people who, until now, we often work with other conservationists, other people who are like-minded. And this OECMs is not about working with like-minded, it's about working with people who may not have, you know, the good case, if you go to, you know, talk to some farmers about biodiversity, you might have a shotgun pointed at you. These are the realities of the ground. So I think it is new. People are trying to work it out. They're trying to find new ways of working. And it's all a learning process. And some countries have already been doing this before because they've already had these conflicts. And other countries, this is all new for them. And of course, in Europe mostly believes that they have nearly reached the 30%. Sweden, as I said, it's only got 15%. And so obviously, OECMs are a bit more interesting for them.
Merci beaucoup. Beaucoup de questions autour du processus de déclaration. Comment ça marche? Vous l'avez tous un peu évoqué, mais j'ai des questions précises, par exemple, d'une ONG au Cameroun qui dit, nous, on a déjà trouvé beaucoup de territoires qui pourraient être de magnifiques AMSES. Comment ça marche? Est-ce que nous, en tant qu'ONG, on peut le déclarer? Et auprès de qui? Olivier, je te voyais hocher la...
Je veux pas dominer. So it is up to, in theory, an NGO can report directly to the UNEP WCMC database. But this can cause confusion because you also have the states declaring, and so you need a two-way process. But in the end of the day, you know, most of where we see OECMs today are very much reported by the states. There are very few that have been reported by NGOs. There are a couple who are being reported by indigenous and local communities, but very few. So most of the reporting at the moment is going through the states rather than the NGOs. But in theory, NGOs should be able to report directly to UNEP WCMC Protected Area Database.
Thank you. Alors, cette question pour Khalid, là aussi, beaucoup de questions qui tournent autour du processus. Comment le statut ou le label d'AMSES peut être perdu? Est-ce que quelqu'un contrôle que la gestion a évolué? Est-ce que quelqu'un évalue le fait que il y a eu des destructions massives dans cette ère de conservation? Comment ça marche? Est-ce qu'il y a un risque de perdre le label et qui contrôle la perte du label?
Interesting. So as some of my colleagues have already said, first of all, there's a very little understanding on OECMs. Let me just repeat that again. Second is, even with that little understanding, whatever we are talking about in terms of, forget about destruction. We are not even clear what is the longevity we are talking about. When even the guidance, we don't know what longevity of OECMs are we talking about in terms of in situ long term. What is long term? 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? We don't even know. So plus, when we talk about the lands beyond protected areas, and when it comes to the communities, and just now people were asking about reporting. Yeah, NGOs can report, but the land issue is a sovereign issue. You cannot bypass the government and give the territories to somebody. And what is indigenous community reporting as a territory, or me as a private person reporting from an NGO, a territory as an OECM, and the government doesn't agree because their boundaries don't match with your boundaries, you are at a risk. So we can't do that double counting, and WCMC will not be able to be in a position to even put it on the map unless it really ratifies from the country. That is a political risk for us. And that sensitivity, we will have to understand it, no matter what we say. And also in terms of looking at the conservation stake, because it is such a complex land tenure system, given the multiple dimensions of the land use, OECMs is not going to be easy. We have seen in Asia, India has got 16 plus categories of defined in the OECM. Korea has similarly many categories. Thailand has about 16 plus categories. Yes, those have been defined. But when it comes to really looking at conserving and those things, it is still, I think so, a lot of questions need to be answered. And also, just the last thing to say, yes, WCMC is the organization to receive the reporting on the OECMs like WDPA, but we as conservationists, how much have we enabled WCMC to really start receiving when the world starts reporting, and you get thousands in numbers of OECMs coming in? Really, WCMC does it have the capacity to handle those in a short span of time? Have we enabled the capacity of WCMC to put those up? That's also a big question, even monitoring. And then reporting back and monitoring, which is a step like Z step. We are just creating it. We don't even know it. It's just 3 years we have started to talk about OECM. So we have a lot of other questions to be answered on that.
Merci beaucoup. Marie?
Oui, on a différentes questions qui portent sur la place des communautés locales dans la gouvernance de ces espaces, dans la gestion de ces espaces, et notamment sur aussi la question des aires et des territoires du patrimoine autochtone et communautaire, les APAC en français et ICA en anglais, il me semble. Est-ce qu'elles peuvent devenir AMSES?
Olivier, pour répondre à cette question, et après j'aurai une question pour le docteur Ha.
Merci. So in theory, originally when OECMs were created, the idea of having APACs and ICCAs as being part of OECMs was there. However, over time and more recently, we're seeing all these that OECMs are becoming, well, for some ICCA members, are becoming really taking on this top-down approach, and that frightens them. And so, in fact, in Europe, what's happening is that because the European Union has said that OECMs have to be contract-based, we're now having countries saying we don't want to be indigenous communities and local communities in Europe saying we don't want to have a contract base, we want to be recognized as an ICCA. So the people behind ICCA, les APAC, Grazia, Christian, and so on and so forth, they are now going to be approaching the CBD in the next COP to see if the ICCAs could be a third pathway to be recognized as 30%. Which is what Grazia had wanted all those years ago when she started with IUCN, started to talk about OECMs. But yes, at the moment, in the end of the day, it really depends on the ICCA, on the APAC, on the community, what they want to be. After all, the ICCAs are meant to be a way of communities to be recognized, self-recognition of their role in various conservation and development objectives.
Thank you, Oliver. Dr. Sakile, you wanted to add something? No?
Yes, I just wanted to add on to that and say from the CBD perspective, if you look at Target 3 says that areas are to be protected it has three sort of main approaches: through systems of protected areas, through other effective area based conservation measures, OECMs, and taking into consideration indigenous and traditional territories. And I think that sort of goes to the point that Olivia was making, that indigenous peoples and local communities have not had positive experiences so far with OECMs. And so the convention, the Conference of Parties, have established a subsidiary body under the convention on Article 8J and other provisions relating to indigenous peoples and local communities. And the next meeting, the first meeting of the subsidiary body, is going to consider this issue of indigenous and traditional territories under Target 2 and Target 3 of the framework. And it is a self-expression of indigenous peoples and local communities on how they wish to see indigenous and traditional territories addressed under Target 2 and Target 3.
C'est important de préciser tout cela, évidemment. Docteur Hao, on a bien compris que la déclaration de OECM, c'est une décision, c'est un acte très politique en fait. C'est un choix des pays de s'orienter là-dessus et pour notamment atteindre l'objectif 30-30. La Corée était un pays déjà qui avait beaucoup d'aires protégées. Quel a été le déclencheur politique qui a fait que la Corée a décidé de s'intéresser particulièrement aux AMSES, aux OECM?
So we developed the new MBSAPs. So OECM concepts is well embedded into new MBSAPs, the PIPS MBSAPs. So we is setting up separately the target on the OECMs. So the terrestrial land is 20% of protected areas, 10% of the for OECMs. So we setting up the separate targets. So separate targets could be the get some provide some more motivation to various stakeholders, including the private sectors, I think. And so can I if I add some more information on the private sector to report directly to the UNEP WCMC, as far as I know, so if in case to private sector report to the directly UNEP WCMC, then UNEP WCMC so ask to government sector to review that site. Then after get some consensus from the government sector, they uploading the database on the WDOECM or WDPA.
Merci beaucoup pour cette précision. Marie, une dernière question et après on passera à la conclusion.
Oui, une dernière question qui porte sur l'intérêt pour les pays qui ont déjà atteint leurs objectifs en termes d'aires protégées, pour eux de déclarer des zones en AMSES.
Alors cette question sera pour Khalid, de manière à équilibrer le temps de parole et puis on laissera les derniers mots à Sakile. Quel est l'intérêt pour un
The
pays?
best example I would just say for this is Bhutan is already landlocked. It has got already 60% of its protected area well there, but still to maintain that level, and as I said in my early presentation, to keep that as a living landscape, we do require, and what Bhutan is looking at the other way is recognizing their biological corridors as OECMs. So what they basically function as some of those areas which are connected for between the protected areas, they would be designated as OECMs to keep the contiguity and interconnectedness of the protected area systems. So there is a pathway there. Still, they may have achieved more than 30%, but to keep that bar high and consistent and to keep the biodiversity interlocked and conserved at the level which they want as a national target, this is how they are looking at, and that is something very encouraging and some lessons learned for other countries where there's already people are talking about the targets which have been achieved on 30 by 30.
Merci beaucoup. Avant de finir par un tour de table pour avoir un dernier mot de chacun d'entre vous pour donner du courage et de l'ambition aux OECM à l'échelle internationale, peut-être une idée portée par Julie qu'on connaît bien et qui dit que ce serait peut-être aussi intéressant de déclarer ces territoires-là par rapport à ce qui est effectivement interdit en termes de destruction des habitats, en termes de surexploitation des ressources. Ça peut être aussi un moyen aussi efficace de définir des vrais territoires qui sont réellement protégés par rapport à des territoires où c'est plus complexe de savoir si les enjeux de gestion sont respectés sur le long terme. Déjà, le respect des interdictions, ça pourrait être quelque chose d'intéressant à suivre. Sakile, on vous laissera le dernier mot. je fais un petit tour de table. On va commencer par celui qui est le plus éloigné au niveau horaire, celui qui va se coucher le plus tôt. Docteur Eo, chez vous, il est très tard. Un dernier mot pour parler des OECM, s'il vous plaît.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me. This valuable, there's webinars, and so encourage to identify OECMs. The first thing we need to do is to raising the awareness of the various sectors. And another thing is you need to, in Korea case, we try to make the legal base to effective identifying the OECMs, the whole of the countries. So the making some simple legal base to effectively identify OECMs and then provide some proper incentive systems, something like that. Very important to the institutional background. So I think it's two things: raising awareness and so make some simple legal base is very important too, I think. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup. On va continuer dans l'ordre du globe avec Khalid Pacha, s'il vous plaît, un dernier mot.
Yeah, I would just say that and repeat again, it's too early. Let's wait and watch and do not start hurry in legalizing and putting it as a jacketing into the OECMs. Let's find enabling pathways into existing policies and legislation to mainstream OECMs. And also at the same time, while we do that, do make sure that OECMs are very well embedded and deep-seated into your NBSAPs so that they become a part of your national, subnational policy with the actors which have to be involved. The non-state actors will play a major role, and we should be looking at the non-state actors if we have to really make OECMs more effective and equitable in the way, the pathway to contribute. That's it.
Merci beaucoup, Khalid. Olivier?
I think, yes, Khalid is correct. I mean, it is early days. Let's not shoot the bird before it's flown the nest. We need to leave the pathways open to these systems. And these systems are complicated, but they are, a way to be able to recognize all different types of conservation that are out there. And some of these, let's also be balanced in the way that we compare OECMs with protected areas. We have talked a bit about what do we mean by long term. We could say exactly the same for protected areas. In Europe, we have protected areas that are renewed every 10 years. Is that long term? Let's have an equal hand and compare both together, but not immediately say that OECMs are a junior partner of protected areas.
Merci beaucoup. Et Sakile, s'il vous plaît, je vous laisse la conclusion de ce très beau webinaire. Merci à tous à nouveau d'avoir participé. Sakile, pour vous les derniers mots.
Thank you. In my language, we say "Indlamuva Ngosi," he who eats last is king or queen. So thank you for giving me the last word. I just want to remind everybody that as we speak about OECMs and protected areas and the 30% goal, that it is the quality of biodiversity in those areas. So let's not forget about the qualitative aspects of the target as well. Representativity, connectivity, governance, areas that are important for biodiversity as well. So, thank you.
Bien, merci encore à tous. Nous avons largement dépassé le temps qu'on s'était fixé, mais nous avons rarement eu autant de questions. Donc, merci à tous nos 4 panélistes d'avoir aussi bien répondu, d'avoir intéressé les nombreuses personnes qui s'étaient connectées. Merci à vous et puis bonjour, bonne nuit, bon appétit en fonction de là où vous êtes. Et puis à très bientôt pour de nouveaux épisodes sur la conservation des îles, des côtes et des océans à l'échelle mondiale. Merci à tous.